This evening, delighted to welcome back Mark Regan on behalf of Leicester Guild. Mark, thank you so much for not only presenting to us once, but coming back to do another one. So thank you so much for that. So this evening's topic is the 1933 restoration of St Mary le Bow in central London. So I'll hand it over to you, Mark, and I can see your screen. I'll take it everyone else can. So I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everyone. In 1980, I rang at St Mary le Bow for the first time. I rang a peal there, and at that time the bells were quite rare. They weren't rung very much, and I thought no more of it. And 6 months later, I started working at Express newspapers in London, and the college youths asked me to become steeple keeper. So I did that, and then eventually I went on the PCC, and 6 years later I became a church warden, and it was an absolute privilege to be there, and it was great fun, and I was married there, and my children were baptized there. But there was something about the sort of folklore of St Mary le Bow that absolutely fascinated me, and there was a mystery that when the current bells were restored, something fairly odd happened. And let me go to the next picture. So here we have three great bells of Bow. The one on the left was cast in 1763 by Leicester and Pack. The one in the middle was cast by Gillett and Johnson in 1933. And the one on the right, the current great bell of Bow, was cast in 1956. In 28 years, the tower contained 3 different rings of bells. And for 16 of those years, the tower was derelict because it was bomb damaged. The link with Mears and Stainbanks and Whitechapel at this time was really, for about 200 years, they cast the bells and they cared for the bells. But something really odd happened in 1933. And this is the mystery. So if you look at the inscription of the current tenor, it gives all the dates when it was known to have been cast, and deliberately the 1933 date was omitted. It was omitted by the PCC, the vestry. And I thought, I want to find out why. Because people knew about Gordon Selfridge having some distant connection, and everyone knew with this folklore about this fantastic ring of bells, which were only rung for 8 years. And I was very lucky enough to ring with people who had rung on the bells. So why was this date omitted? And all the inscriptions on the 12 bells are really complex, so it couldn't have been an accident. But let's go back a little bit in history to talk about St Mary le Bow. It was built, the first church we think was built just after the Norman conquest, and it was built by Archbishop Lanfranc, who was I think William the Conqueror's uncle. No one's quite sure. And it was built actually while William was building the Tower of London, and Lanfranc built it to keep an eye on William, actually, because the head office of the church moved from Winchester to Canterbury. And for a long time, in fact, until 1930, St Mary le Bow was in the Diocese of Canterbury and not London. But its story is fascinating because Cheapside, cheap, is the Saxon word for market. So Cheapside, there are quite a few in the country, is the market street. And if you walk down Cheapside, you see Bread Lane, Honey Lane, etc., etc. So this was the heart of London. And if you look at the top of the tower here on the right, the picture on the right is the Great Seal of St Mary le Bow, and there's these lanterns on the top. Now these were lit at night so people could tell where the centre of the city was. And Dick Whittington probably didn't hear the bells to come back to London. He probably saw the lanterns. But the bells, from the earliest records we've got, going back about 1340, the bells mark the rhythm of city life. They mark the curfew. You heard Bow bells, you'd start work. You heard them again in the evening, you'd stop work. And if you read the Shardlake novels, there's lots of references to Bow bells, even in those in the 16th century. So this was probably the most important church in the city of London. It was the richest, certainly until 1868. and it was destroyed a bit later. So that's an image, a created image of what Cheapside looked like in the 16th century. In 1643, because the city was parliamentarian, the Eleanor Cross, which is on the previous picture, and this is right by St Paul's Cathedral, was pulled down to the ringing of bells and no hurt done at all. So the bells were actually used a lot, not only for religion, but to mark important civic and civil events. And they played quite a role in just the rhythm of London life. So in 1666, St Mary le Bow is burnt down. Wren rebuilds it, and this is with St Bride's and St Paul's, these three churches regarded as Wren's masterpieces. So that's roughly what you see now. Now, the balcony here was Charles II insisted the balcony was built so we could watch the Lord Mayor's show without fear of assassination, because his position as monarch was still quite precarious. So this was a very prosperous street in the city. The tower actually cost more than the church to build. And if you move to the picture to the right, which is actually a slight Victorian fake, the picture was taken in 1890 and the images and the picture were superimposed. You can just see to the left a Greenwich time ball, which is how you'd set your watch in the 19th century. On the hour, the ball went up and then dropped down, you could set your watch. So this is the very busy Cheapside, just as busy as it would have been in the 16th century. And St Mary le Bow is really at the heart of this. And we know the nursery rhyme and so forth. So it was it's a sort of cultural reference point for especially Londoners. So we move to 1863, and that shot on the left is a picture of just looking over London. And the ringing room, this isn't where it is now, is there, right underneath the bells. So we know that they were cast as a ring of 8 in 1669 by Christopher Hodson. The tenor was recast in 1738. The rest of them were recast in 1763 to become a ring of 10. And then they were turned into a 12 in 1881, just after St Paul's became a ring of 12. And the picture on the right is taken from the Illustrated London News in 1865. They did quite a lot of work on ringing. They published quite a lot, and they also published stuff by Dickens. And there's a story about when he went to watch ringers at Southwark Cathedral. So here's a picture of the ringing room. These were taken in 1911. And I think this is what sort of London ringing rooms must have looked like at the turn of the century. Norman Summerhayes told me, because he actually opened up St Bride's in the 30s. He said there were so many rings of bells in London that people, Pye and the college users rang them, wore them out, and then moved on to the next tower. Except for St Mary le Bow and St Bride's, which became a bit of a battlefield really between the Pye band and the college youths. And St Mary le Bow were run quite a lot. So at this time there are 5,300 weight 12. And the ringers at that time, they had their own band who were paid, which was quite unusual for London at that time. So this is quite a famous picture of 4 college youths taken in 1926 in the ringing room. And this was the first recording of bells made by the BBC. And it was used as a time signal on the World Service until quite recently. It was also broadcast during the Second World War to the Free Peoples of Europe. And in 1985, we had a visit from men and women who were members of the Norwegian resistance. And they used to hear Bow bells, and the broadcasting of the bells often preceded important messages which were sent in code on the World Service. But this is the amazing sound of the back 10, because let's hear it first. Some of you may remember that sound. They were supposed to ring 12, but when they left the pub to go to the church, one of them fell over and broke his wrist. And the ringer, let me tell you who are there. On the left is Ted Fenn, Chalice Winnie, and Henry Passmore, and Bob Newton, Henry R. Newton. And Henry R. Newton rang the tenor to Appeal of London Major in 1911. And he was a slip of a man and a phenomenal tenor ringer. And apparently he and Bill Pye almost had a fight at St Mary le Bow, but then again, that's another story. So that's the first recording of bells ever made by the BBC and still used. And that's the only record we have of this very old-fashioned pre-Simpson Pack and Chapman sound. But things were to change, and they were to change quite dramatically in the 1920s, because it's interesting, because talking to all of you from Leicestershire, is that obviously Taylors had been Simpson tuning bells since 1896. And the country is very much divided between Taylors and Whitechapel. The Midlands and the North was Taylors, as you know, and the South, especially London, the Southeast, was Whitechapel country. Even the first Simpson ring of bells in London didn't appear till 1920 in the Royal Exchange, and they were cast as a chime. So the London College youths at that time were very anti-Simpson tuning. And that was partly because of Bert Hughes, who was a central figure in this story, because he didn't like it. And he was also the reason why the college youths stopped admitting women in 1919. So Bert and his contemporaries in London ringing were very old-fashioned. None of them had fought in the war, and they belonged to that late Victorian Edwardian era of London ringing. Now, in 1926, there was a massive consistory court case about the bells at Coventry Cathedral, which hadn't been rung for 40 years. And Cyril Johnson had approached St Michael's Coventry, it was a parish church then, to say, I'll recast your bells for you. And the Chancellor of the diocese wasn't at all happy about it. And Bert Hughes was called up to give evidence, and a lot of college youths were brought up to give evidence to say they were the finest ring of bells ever cast. Ironic, as it hadn't been rung for 40 years. And also at that time, E. Alexander Young wanted to pass a motion with the Central Council to ban Simpson tuning. They actually wanted to ban it. The court case was lost. The bells were, thankfully, I think, recast into the fantastic Ring of 12 we can enjoy now. But remember, at that time, they were still they were installed as a chime of 14. Sorry. The church on the right is Clerkenwell. Now, these were the first Simpson-tuned ringing bells in the city in London, or just outside London, just outside the city. They were cast in 1928. And the vicar wanted to have something done about the bells. He'd approached Mears and Stainbanks. He approached Cyril Johnson. Cyril Johnson phoned him up at 5 o'clock in the evening and said, I'll give you £365 towards the restoration of your bells if we can start work now. The bells were out of the tower by midnight. He smashed them up the next day, and it was all done without a faculty. And there was an enormous court case over that, but it was too late. And Cyril Johnson was absolutely admonished for his work, but he got what he wanted, a foothold into the London market, because the country was divided between the two great firms. Warner stopped trading in the Great War. But Cyril Johnson, who we'll talk about later, was determined to break into the City of London. So these three towers, the Royal Exchange, St Michael's Coventry and Clerkenwell, are a sort of precursor to what was later to happen at St Mary le Bow. So these are the bells at the Royal Exchange. They're still there. The clock's broken. Well, the clock works, but the chiming apparatus is broken. They're absolutely beautiful and sort of quite similar to Coventry in a way, but almost the same weight. So these bells appeared, but because they weren't ringing bells, no one took any interest in them. And here we come to the three key characters in our story. On the left is Gordon Selfridge, and if any of you watched the TV series about Selfridge, it was pretty accurate. On the top right is Cyril Johnson. On the bottom left are the Hughes family. On the left is Bill Hughes, who's Alan Hughes' dad, Bert Hughes in the middle, and Doug Hughes on the right. Now, you can even see from the pictures how different these people are. Cyril Johnson survived the Great War. He was in the trenches in 1915. He was a subaltern. His father died, and because of the death of his father, he was called back to run the business. And if it probably hadn't been for that, he'd have been killed in the war. Selfridge built Selfridge's, the first department store in London, in 1911. And he was an American who wanted to return to Albion. He wanted to become English. He loved the English way of life. And if you look at Selfridge's, which we'll do in the middle, it's quite a palace, really. It's a very sort of English building. Now, these two were to meet. The Hughes family got on very well with the Taylor family, and they had gentleman agreements between how work was divided amongst the country. And then Cyril Johnson turns up. And in the process of doing all this research, I met his wife, who was quite a lot younger than he was, and his daughter, Rosemary Price, who lived in the New Forest, and his other daughter in the States, because Cyril Johnson had two families, as most of you will know. He had a family in the States and a family in England. And his daughter in the States, Jill Johnson, has written a brilliant biography of all of Cyril's work. So Cyril was the new man on the block. He was one of these men who'd survived the Great War, and his view on life was quite different from those who hadn't fought in the war. So here we come to Selfridge's. The clock on the left, the Queen of Time, absolutely beautiful. Above it, there's a 4-ton clock bell. And I started researching this in about 1990 on and off. And in 1996, I spent a week in Selfridge's archive going through all the papers about the clock and about the bells, and just how Cyril and Gordon Selfridge met. Fascinating place to go. An amazing building when you would go around inside it. And the librarian, who now dead sadly, he was in his 80s back in the 1990s, had started as a day boy at Selfridge's while Selfridge was still there. So in the West End of London, all this commerce is now invading this strange world of ringing and the Hughes family. These are the Dolly sisters. We have the expression Dolly Bird, and this is where it comes from. These were models for Selfridge, and Selfridge had this fantastic flamboyant lifestyle. He mixed with Beaverbrook at the papers. He raced horses. He'd gamble at Monte Carlo, and he had more than a passing interest in the Dolly Birds, as did Cyril Johnson. So I think that picture absolutely sums up Cyril Johnson to me. Completely different to the Hughes. He's a new boy in the block. He's very successful, and it's a Wolsey, by the way, if you want to know what the car is. And he's the man about town. And we know he had an affair with at least one of the Dolly Birds. So this is a change to how ringing normally works. But then, so what's happening at St Mary Le Bow? That's what the church looked like before it was bombed. And my predecessors, the vestry, the PCC, weren't drawn from the congregation, which at that time was quite large. They were drawn from decent chaps from the city. And St Mary Le Bow in the 1920s was in serious trouble. The spire had been struck by lightning in 1912, and it was in a state of repair. The organ had stopped working. There was death watch beetle in the roof. And in 1926, the bells were declared unringable. In 1925, there'd been a long length rung on them. And just a few months later, when there was another BBC recording, Bill Pye packed up ringing the tenor to Double Norwich Court Bob Major, and Pye was regarded as the greatest ringer of the time. So suddenly it became a matter of national interest. There were letters in the Times saying Bow bells are silent and they won't be rung again. And this vestry, this PCC, who really hid from public life, suddenly found themselves thrust in the limelight, that their famous bells were silent. And that's what the church looked like in 1929. So a picture of Cheapside in 1929. The towers, it's been scaffolded for 2 years, no work's taken place. And PCC, the vestry, are in serious trouble by now. They've tried, they need to raise about £4,000. They're failing. And it's getting quite embarrassing for the City of London. Of course, this is 1929. The great crash has happened. There is no money. And at this time, there's a lot of resentment towards America and Americans because of the great crash. And this will be important for our story later on. So St Mary Le Bow is shut. It was closed to the public in 1929 and wasn't opened again until 1933. So what was going on? That's a picture of the old bells, the Pack and Chapman, the first ring of bells. That's the architect E.A. Underwood. If you look at the louvers, they're open. So they must have been tremendously loud outside. That must have been great to hear. But you can see 1911 steeple keeping there. Actually, that's taken in 1927. That's 1927 steeple keeping. He was architect till about 1945. But I love the hat. It just shows what Cheapside was like at that time. And this room, this is the vestry of St Mary Le Bow. It's a beautiful piece of late 17th century and Georgian architecture, obviously destroyed in the war. If you come out of the picture, there was another big table there. It's still the vestry now, but in that room, this is the room where the story happened. So the PCC, the vestry, are really struggling to raise money. The city are quite embarrassed. So they say, right, we're going to get someone to help you. And they bring in a man called Louis Newton, who'd been Lord Mayor in the early 1920s. Bert Hughes, who'd been looking after the bells for years, put in a quote to restore them, to make them ringable, although he insisted there was nothing wrong with them. But people said they couldn't ring them, so fair enough. The PCC still couldn't raise money. Bert Hughes just assumed he would get the job because that's how things happened. So the vestry, the people met in this room for years. They sort of ran the church. It had run out of money. In fact, when the central line was built, because it was an open cast excavation, the church was compensated a lot of money and they just lost it. They blew it completely. And despite all the property the church owned, they had no cash in the bank. And then this man there, Louis Newton, turned up and he said, right, we're going to sort this out. This is far too embarrassing. I want competitive quotations. And the PCC were outraged. They wouldn't do that. And he said, no, you've got to have competitive quotations. So he's got in touch with Gillett and Johnson. This is where the story gets quite murky, because on the picture on the right is the tenor at Londonderry, which was cast in 1929. So Louis Newton's gone into St Mary Le Bow in 1930-31 to sort them out. Louis Newton knew Cyril Johnson because Newton was involved in the Anglo-Irish Society, which is a sort of funny thing in the City of London. It was like a livery company in the 17th century that colonized London as Derry, and that's why it's called Londonderry. And it became a sort of just an old city sort of company by the 20th century, but they had strong connections with Derry. Now the bells are recast, and Louis Newton's name is on this bell. There we go, Louis Newton. So he knew Cyril Johnson. So when he wanted competitive quotes, it's more than likely that there was some talk beforehand. So Cyril Johnson saw his chance, in he goes to quote. But still, there's no money. At the same time, in 1931, Cyril Johnson is doing a lot of work with Selfridge. And Selfridge wants to become English. He wants to contribute to Englishness. And what better way to become connected than to be connected with St Mary le Bow, the home of the most famous ring of bells in the country. So Louis Newton turns up at a vestry meeting and says, I fixed the money. There's an anonymous donor will pay for it. And this anonymous donor is American. And the vestry were absolutely outraged. They actually said in PCC minutes, we can't accept vulgar money from America at this church. Why can't we find a nice patriotic Englishman to restore our famous bells for us? And Newton got quite cross about this. Now, this devastated Bert Hughes, because he loathed Johnson by this time. And Bert Hughes offered to do the job for nothing. He said, we'll do anything you want, we'll do it for nothing, because we really value our long-standing association with the church. But it was too late. Newton had committed the job to Cyril Johnson. And then at the next vestry meeting, Newton said the donor is F. Gordon Selfridge. And the vestry were absolutely shocked. So we got in the newspapers. Johnson got what he wanted, the prestige of a fantastic ring of bells. Selfridge got what he wanted, a load of fantastic press. But this is the sort of thing they did. This was an event put on at the London Hippodrome in 1931, called Bow Bells. If you look at the bottom, this is like crowdfunding with the aristocracy. The Duke of York's there, a load of aristocracy, see people on the right, big cheeses in the city. So Johnson is seriously networking with people who can influence his business, and he's really using his link with Newton. And to someone like Selfridge, this is just fantastic. He's mixing with English aristocracy. He's an American that wants to move into that world. And it says, have graciously consented to be present. If you'd have showed this to the Hughes family, they'd have been totally shocked. This wasn't their world at all. So there's a bit more there. It says here on the right what needed to be done in the church. There's a message from the President of the Appeal, Louis Newton, and also from the Archbishop of Canterbury, remembering that St Mary le Bow is still in the Diocese of Canterbury. There's a strong link. And this sort of stuff got in the news. This was it was the social life of an Evelyn Waugh novel as well, because there's so many accounts of Johnson and Selfridge partying, going to the races, going gambling, and much more. So the work starts. There's letters in the Times about the willful destruction of the great bell of Bow, the finest bell ever cast. Cyril Johnson insisted it was cracked. Bert Hughes said it wasn't. And here's the bell coming down in 1933, and there's Johnson on the right and the vicar, Gordon Ponsonby. And the top right, you can see a slight crack in the crown, and that's a picture of the bell when it was broken up in 1933. So famous, the famous bell of Bow with its link of Whitechapel is taken out of the tower to be smashed up. Selfridge has got what he wants. And this was in the papers everywhere. And there's the Ring of 12 at Croydon, just before they were broken up. I think I might turn that into a jigsaw for Sally next year. I think it'd be quite a good jigsaw. It's quite sad to see them, especially when we've heard them. And look at this massive headstock that was put on the tenor. And there was a bar that went through to stop it flexing. They had a lot of trouble with how the bell rang. So that's the bells before they were smashed up. And when the great bell of Bow was cast, Cyril Johnson invited anyone who was anybody to Croydon to watch it. It was a big social event. It was reported in all the papers. Here's a picture of the bell being cast with a massive audience. And Selfridge is there. He's got his wish. And there they are. Only 8 of them were cast again. 4 were kept. 4, 5, 9, 11. And you see the interesting different size of the 10th and the 11th, almost similar. And here are the bells in the foundry yard. Another press photograph. And that lovely picture of the tenor. And I love the fashions on the left, just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then the bell goes up. That's Cyril Johnson's wife on the right. And one of these people we think is Ted Collins, Frederick E. Collins, who was Chris Kippin's godfather, who put the bells in. And I spoke to him quite a bit about them in the late 80s. So the Great Bell of Bow goes back up the tower. And this is a picture of the first time they were rung by the college youths. I'll name them for you as well. On the left here is William S. Langdon, F.M. Buckler, Chalice Winnie. Oh, sorry, no, that's Bill Cockrell. Dick Deal, Percy Clark, Tom Langdon, Harry Langdon, Chalice Winnie, then Alf Peck, who's on the tenor box, and Harry Passmore, Ted Venn, and E.H. Lewis. You see a difference in the ringing room as well from the pre-restoration ringing room. Dark, musty, Victorian. It was cleaned, it was painted. The peel boards are all moved. But there, you're right underneath the bells. There's about 2 feet above the ceiling to where the bells are. And the folklore was they were the best ring of bells, and sort of ringing at Worcester, I feel a bit, challenged by that, but I thought you might like to hear them. They're quite stunning, aren't they? There were only 8 peals rung on the bells. They were notoriously difficult to ring. Johnson was called back several times to do work to them. Ron Dove, who I think worked for Taylor secretly, you probably know more about that than I did, was always writing letters back to the Taylors about how dissatisfied London ringers were with the bells. And talking to people who rang there, they said they made an awesome sound, but they're very hard to hear. But it all came to an end. It all came to an end in 1941. The church was burnt by incendiary bombs, and that's a picture taken in the belfry. So they were rung. They only survived 8 years, and that's what the church looked like. That was the picture on the left was taken just before the tower was burnt out. The picture on the right, the same time the bells were destroyed. The church was very badly damaged. And here we go. So we're after the war. So the church was bombed in 41, 42. The bells weren't rung again till 1961. They weren't cast till 1956. We're worried about not ringing for 9 months. A lot of bells all around the country, especially in big cities, weren't put in for years and years and years. So this is Cheapside. This is St Mary le Bow in the late 1940s. You can see the scale of the damage. Absolutely, it's incredible. So the tower's boarded up. There is no money. There's no money at all. I just love this picture of service. However, the city was determined that St Mary le Bow would still be active, it would still be used. It was used for services as soon as it was cleaned up, as was St Bride's. And interestingly, over half of the bell metal rescued from St Bride's and St Mary le Bow disappeared. No one knows where it went. It was supposed to be stored securely, but it just disappeared. So there's a picture taken from the tower. And in the early 1950s, the tower starts to be restored. So the spire was taken off. A big concrete subframe was put in and it was rebuilt. Now, if you watch the Ealing comedies, especially the Lavender Hill mob, there are a lot of car chases in it, and some of them are around Cheapside, and you see these images in the Lavender Hill mob. So, but London was absolutely deserted. Now, this building on the right, which was finished in, I think, 1960-ish, has been pulled down twice. It shows how things move. So the tower on the picture on the right, the spire's going up. So we're getting ready, but still no bells. Now, this man, John Trustram, was the vestry clerk, and there he is with a piece of one of the bells. Now, by this time, Henry Newton, Gordon Selfridge, and Cyril Johnson are dead. The vestry, of which he was a key member, they felt totally stitched up and steamrollered by those three. And it was a massive cause of resentment. They didn't like what had happened, but they still wanted Bow Bells back again. So what happened next? This man comes along. He's Cuthbert Ackroyd. He became a church warden in 1948. And I met his son, who was a church warden. It shows it was still handed down father to son. And he was Lord Mayor in 1955, 56. Now, each mayor has a charity, and his charity was the restoration of Bow Bells. It was going to be a big thing for the City of London. So Cuthbert Ackroyd, successful businessman, well connected, he started to raise money for the bells. So in the 1950s, these are pictures actually taken in Berlin. Bits of the bells were sent all around Europe to help raise money and raise profile. I just like the thought of Bow Bells going to Berlin is quite good, really. So a lot of public notices, lots of publicity, but times were hard and money was very hard to raise. However, 1956, they were cast again. This is the College Youth Bell being cast, and that's Stan Mason there, who was master. Some of you may have known him. There's Bert Hughes, and Stan's wife, Wynne, is just over there. So that's the second bell at St Mary le Bow. And the bells were, so there's one more, that's Cuthbert Ackroyd with Bert Hughes, and the bells were wired up to the Carter ringing machine, so Cuthbert Ackroyd could hear them in his year of office. It'll be another 5 years before they go to the tower, so they're in the Foundry Yard. Sorry, that picture's out of sync. This is Cuthbert Ackroyd and his wife puddling the 11th, which was his bell. So 5 years between being cast and being hung. But it happens. These are the bells going back. There's Doug Hughes there with the 11th. And on the right, there's Doug Hughes and Bill Theobald, who actually put the bells in. Most of you will have known him or known of him. When I became steeplekeeper, I used to pick him up on a Sunday morning. He'd have an armful of newspapers. He'd sit on the bell frame doing crosswords and teach me how to do steeplekeeping. Then I'd used to go and spend an evening with the pub in him, which was always a disaster. Look at these inscriptions. The PCC, Bert Hughes actually asked the PCC whether they wanted the 1933 inscription put on the bell, and they just adamantly said no. And that was it. So they got their own back. They rewrote history. But even after all those years, the old vestry still felt very, very bitter about being steamrolled by Johnson and also by Selfridge. It's bitter. And some of the people I met who were in their 80s then, either their fathers or they could remember the story and the incident. The feeling was quite powerful. So the bells were first rung in 1961 in November. Front page of the London Evening News, which then was the biggest circulating evening paper. There's the Duke of Edinburgh there. A big story again. So the third ring of bells to ring from that tower in 33 years. Just a phenomenal thing. 3 big rings of 12, and for 16 years the tower is derelict. And this weird coincidence of events, Selfridge meeting Johnson, Johnson survives the war, the advent of Simpson tuning, London doesn't want Simpson tuning, a new breed of business person going into the bell market. But it ended quite sadly for Johnson. The firm was virtually bankrupt just after the war. He died in 1950. Selfridge died owing the bank a fortune. I think the bank were in more trouble than Selfridge. Selfridge borrowed against the store, so he lost control of it. However, the Hughes family were still there, rock solid, still there. And in the city, people have long memories. So the bells rang out. They weren't rung a lot. I think it took about 5 years for the Cumberlands to ring a peal there. When I first rang there, they were hardly rung. The tower was full of asbestos, which was put all over all the concrete to stop the bells, because the concrete had a bad effect on the acoustics. And one of the first things I did, well, we had to get the asbestos taken out. And Alan Hughes brought his dad along, because Alan had watched the bells being cast, and so had his dad. And I got to know Bill and Doug quite well. And Alan said he was outside in the street when we rang the bells for the first time, and his dad started crying. It was the first time he'd heard the bells properly, because everyone thought they were rubbish, but the asbestos really spoilt them. And so then I worked with the Whitechapel, and especially Bill and Alan and Bill Theobald, to get the bells into a ringable state and fun to ring. And because all the peal boards and everything had been destroyed, I asked George Pipe, whose dad was in that recording of the Gillett bells. The picture and the recording are different. So George Pipe did all the peal boards, because he had this fantastic connection with Bow. So there it is. That's the mystery of St Mary le Bow and the inscription being deliberately omitted. So Gordon Selfridge and this incredible businessman called Cyril Johnson were involved, and I thought you ought to hear the new bells as you've heard the others. So that's it. That's a bit of a story of my life as well, really, because I had an absolute ball there, and it was a great privilege. And so many other things happened while I was there, but I think the story of Selfridge and Johnson is quite powerful. But also, I couldn't publish a lot of it when I knew about it, because a lot of the people involved were still alive, and the enmity between some of them was still quite apparent. And I was someone actually said to me quietly, just wait a few years. So now I can tell the story properly. So that's it.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That was fascinating. I learnt so much in that. That was brilliant.